Jefferson of Elmore, Alabama. The interviewer is James Smither of Grand Valley State University. Mr. Jefferson, can you start with a little bit of personal background? Where were you born, for instance?
Well, I was born in Newark, New Jersey, July 13, 1924, and was raised there, went to school there, up until I graduated from high school and went to work in civilian jobs until I wanted to join the service. Well, to avoid the draft and subsequent to being unable to or undesiring to join the Navy, because all I could be a cook.
Right.
And I didn't want to cook. And then in the Army, they told me I could drive a truck. I didn't want to do that. And I saw a sign in front of the post office in downtown Newark, and Uncle Sam with, "I want you." And that was a Merchant Marine sign, and I joined up there to where I signed up. Then they transferred me, or transported me rather, to the land title building in Philadelphia where I was inducted. Then I was sent back to Hoffman Island for my basic training, and I was trained in the maintenance operation of marine engine equipment.
All right. Now, can you describe the Hoffman Island facility? What was that like?
Out in the middle of New York Harbor, in November, it was cold, very cold. And the one thing that I remember distinctly was that the submarine nets that they opened for the ships coming from sea into New York Harbor was attached from Staten Island on one side and Hoffman Island on the other, and from Hoffman Island to what they call Brooklyn. It was the tip end of Brooklyn, went just into New York Harbor.
Right.
And the tugboats they used to open would open closer to Hoffman Island because that was where the deep channel was. And it was cold, and we did our daily marching and routines as far as outdoor exercise is concerned. And I had attended classes where they taught us about the operation of engine room equipment, boilers, pumps, the whole, should I say, paraphernalia, academically to an extent that you had to have. And at the end of that, you took a test. They transported us to the Coast Guard building in Manhattan, where you had to go from Hoffman Island to Staten Island, take the Staten Island ferry, from there to New York, the Battery, which was where the Staten Island ferry docked at that time, and still does. And from there you went to, I think it's Church Street, to the courthouse building, and you took your test, and there were 3 levels where initially you could qualify for. I was wiper, fireman, water tender, and oiler for the engine room. And I qualified for if you did any better than that, you could go better to fireman and water tender, and then to oiler, and I got both of those in the test. And from there, your first call was from the National Maritime Union, which called the National Maritime Service Office and told them what they needed for the ships that were going out on convoy.
Okay. Let's back up a little bit to the Hoffman Island experience. About how many people were in the class or group that you were training with?
Approximately 90 to 96 people from all parts of the country. I remember the predominant guys in the same class at that time were from Pennsylvania, Missouri, Missouri, and New Jersey. And that's most of the guys that were there. There were a few from, I think, South Carolina, but it's been so long ago I don't remember distinctly.
Now, do you remember how many of you were African American?
There was only myself as an African American.
And what was that experience like? How did people treat you there at the time?
Well, this might surprise you. At the school itself, well, where I was born in New Jersey, I didn't know anything about discrimination.
Right.
Because I grew up into an integrated neighborhood of Italians, Jewish people, and black people all in the same neighborhood. And my grandparents are from South Carolina, and I used to go there on the summer. That's when I learned about segregation. But the school itself, all of my classes, I was treated just like I was, and I am, another American. It wasn't until I got my first ship that I realized that I was black, and the term they used for black people at that time.
All right. So what was your first ship assignment?
My first ship was a Gulf oil tanker called the Gulf Gem, and what we called a triple expansion engine, a steam engine, reciprocating engine. And the union had called the maritime office and ordered 2 firemen and 2 oilers and a wiper. Well, I was one of the firemen, water tenders. The first ship, when I went on that ship, I was amazed at what a ship, because the first time I'd ever seen one. And that's this huge monstrosity, looked like it was as big as the world.
Right.
And I was amazed. I'd never seen other than a mock-up of an engine room. You were given books to read.
Right.
But to see an actual steam engine, it amazed me. Being 17, I lied about my age in the first place to get in. And it amazed me to what going aboard a ship was like. You can't describe the feeling, unless you're a teenager, going into a completely alien, strange world. That's the best way I can put it. And we were taken up to the chief engineer's office, myself and 3 other guys, and had 3x5 triplex sheets. One went to the chief engineer, described what you were there for, your position. One you kept. The third one went to the union, the National Maritime Union. And the chief engineer asked me, well, you're a wiper, and told me where. I said, no, sir, I'm a fireman. He looked me straight in the face and told me I don't have no niggers in my engine room.
Wow.
That was the first time I found out in the merchant marine what it meant to be a black American. But I told him that the only way I would go back to the union was hall, that he signed one of the slips to send me back. He wouldn't do that. I stayed on the ship. It was rough. He rode me like a horse. But the one thing I could say, under his treatment, I got to be a good fireman because he demanded so much of me.
Because you were going into that situation where you hadn't done this stuff before. You really had to probably learn a lot of it on the job.
Right.
And so now you had an extra incentive to make sure you did it right and learn fast.
I had to live by the book. Luckily, I had studied pretty well, and I knew what the different valves, instruments, I'll call them, the burners, what they were, how you did them, and I managed. The one problem I had, they had periscopes where you could look up through the smokestack when the fires were going to see if you had the right mixture of oil and air.
Right.
Otherwise, you'd get smoke that obliterated your sight. In the periscope, And sooner, no, with me, the chief would call down and tell me I got smoke. Now, if it was white, I had too much air. If it was black, I didn't have enough air. And I listened to that for 6 weeks. Then I went to Liverpool, England, and came back. And he made sure I didn't have any smoke. Because when you got the right mixture, you don't get any smoke.
Right.
And that's what I had to live with, but he stayed on my neck until I learned how to do it right.
Now, when did you make that first voyage?
That I left on I can't remember, it was in February of 44. And we left New York in part of our convoy, headed into the North Atlantic off of the Grand Bank. You joined up with the Canadian part
Right.
of the convoy, and there the convoys picked up what is normally we call the vets. It was almost a motorboat.
There's the corvettes, the really small escort ships.
Small, about the size of our American Coast Guard cutters.
Right.
And they escorted you across the North Atlantic. And from New York, you had the blimps and the Coast Guard going up the coast. But when you got to the Grand Banks, that's when the corvettes took over and took you across. I was very lucky, extremely lucky. I never lost a ship that I was on in a convoy. And in 1944, it was a pool game out there for the German submarines. But I was fortunate. No ship I was on went down.
Now, were there ships in that first convoy that did go down?
I don't remember ever in any convoy that I went in, and it seems odd, and I only made 3 convoys because I shipped into the Mediterranean after I made the 32nd trip. But I don't remember losing any ships. If they were, it was at night, and I had the 4 to 8 watch. And that time it was sunrise or sunset. You're down the engine room, you don't know what they're doing up there unless a torpedo hits your ship.
That's right. Yeah. Well, at that point in the war, the Germans were not as successful with the submarines as they had been a year or so earlier. There were still some out there, and it was still dangerous. But it was probably not. But most of the convoys did get through by then without taking a whole lot of losses.
Right.
But when you're in the engine room, yeah, you wouldn't know.
You don't know what's going on until somebody tell you or you get one. What I do recall, they had a system called the degaussing system around the entire length of the ship. I never really understood what it was, but I assumed it was to demagnetize.
Yeah. They create a separate kind of magnetic field or something like that, so that if the magnetic torpedoes or whatever don't go off.
Yeah, I never knew the technical description of it, but that was an assumption. But every ship I went on had that degaussing system, particularly the Liberty ships, which every seaman just about had to go on.
Right.
And I never lost one, and I was fortunate. I realized that because I was not North Atlantic, it was cold. And it was rough.
Yeah, what was that on that first voyage? I mean, you'd never seen a big boat before. Now you're on one in the middle of the Atlantic. What was that like to ride in?
I got seasick the first voyage. And the first thing the guys gave me, being a teenager, and most of the guys on the ship were older than I was, they got me to eating saltine crackers. Every time I got queasy, I'd eat saltine crackers. I only remember throwing up once. But after that, I got what was called my sea legs.
Right.
And I never got seasick since, and I've never been seasick since then. I guess I was fortunate.
Okay. Now, did you have any really bad weather on that first trip, or was it just ordinary North Atlantic?
Well, I do recall when we went to England the second time, we had planes and tanks on deck. And during a storm, that in the North Atlantic, the waves, the break of the waves, tore two of the planes off the deck. And I had the same thing occur when I went into the Mediterranean, going to Oran, then for Oran to Palermo, that after we crossed into the Mediterranean from Gibraltar, the seas took two locomotives. And I mean, they had, I think, at least 1-inch cables strapped to cleats. And the seas just took them off. But I don't recall ever having lost a guy to the sea from the ship.
Yeah, it's actually pretty surprising how few people get washed off considering all the stuff that they went through and everything else they had.
It is, because all kind of weather, you still got to walk the deck to do your job. And you're lucky if you don't break your neck or break your leg, because the ship is from one end, one side to the other, constantly in rough weather.
Now, was your usual station there in the engine room, was that toward the middle of the ship, or was it in the stern, or where was it?
On tankers, the propulsion unit was on the end with a short, what we call a short shaft. That's where the term, given a short shaft, come from. And it just run maybe 30 or 40 foot from the engine itself to the outside of the ship. Now on cargo ships, the engine room is midships. And you had half of the ship with the shaft running back to the propeller. But that was the main difference, except on some of the later cargo ships. They put the engines back in the aft quarters like they had on tankers because it was more cargo room on the rest of the ship.
Now, when you were on one of those tankers and you were on duty engine room and the sea was rough, were you going up and down a lot with the stern of the ship?
Not so much on the stern as the roll.
Okay. Because I guess it was a big enough and long enough ship, you wouldn't have the bow go up and down as much as in a shorter one, but you'd still roll side to side.
The bow went up a lot more than the stern because the bow was the first thing to hit the waves.
Yeah.
And by the time it got to the mid and the aft end of the ship, it was ready to follow. So that you got the rest of the ship that is bridged in between. So it wasn't too bad back there.
Oh, not so bad. All right. Now, how did you get along with the guys in the crew that you were working with directly? I mean, you had trouble with your chief engineer on that first ship, but what about the rest of the guys?
Except for rare occasions, I got along quite well. Once in a while, you'd get a bully on board ship, and that would happen mostly, at least for me. If you were on the 4 to 8, you took a break, they let give you relief in the engine room to come up and eat. Well, in the mess room, they saved 2 spaces for the 2 men coming up off relief from the engine room. And somebody would take your seat. And one time I had one big guy, I'll never forget his name was Starzinski. Funny how you remember names and incidents. But Starzinski was a big, massive guy. And he was sitting in my seat that I was supposed to eat. Well, I walk up and I told him, this is my seat. He told me to sit on the floor. Big as he was, I told him he was going to move, and I got in a fight with this big guy. Luckily, the crew broke it up. Otherwise, I'd have been smashed. But it eventually worked out, other than a couple of racial epitaphs from what I can term as ignorant, because on the whole, by the vast majority of seamen that I met, was civil.
Right.
And I had by the vast majority, absolutely no racial incidents, except on rare occasions, but you learn to deal with it like you learn to deal with rough seas.
Mm-hmm.
And I apply that to living today.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, did you get much of a chance to go on shore as you went to these places in Europe? You were in England or Italy or Sicily?
Going ashore, you
Yeah.
mean? Oh yeah, you went ashore and usually find a bar
Mm-hmm.
and buy trinkets or something to take back home. I shouldn't say this, but you always look for female companionship. And it's kind of difficult to really elaborate on the, should I say, the intricacies of excursions ashore.
Sure.
But we had our fun, and I got to the point where I used to try to seek out people, regular people, wherever I'd go, I'd avoid going to the bars
Yeah.
and get to know the people in the cities away from the dock
Right.
so that I could better understand and try to learn the language.
Right.
Because if you don't speak the language, you get beat by the language, and then you learn to count.
Mm-hmm.
The only way you learn to count the money is counting with the people you're dealing with.
Yep.
And you learn to bargain.
Mm-hmm.
When you buy something, you learn to distinguish between quality, not only materially, but with the people you meet.
Now, did the people behave differently toward you in England as opposed to Italy, or pretty much the same, or was it just depend who they were?
Yes, being a person of color gave you a sort of advantage, at least from my point of view. You were a relative oddity coming into a port because black Americans were almost, there were rumors that had been put out by Caucasian Americans about some blacks had tails. These rumors and lies were portrayed for various reasons. And I would find a lot of English people would walk up to you and want to see your hair. And that's why your hair is so short. But there were black Americans in World War I that had been to England, had been to France, but that was what a generation before.
Yeah.
And why there was such a lack of knowledge. But the rumors put out by Caucasian Americans about black Americans was for their own purposes.
Yeah.
But it didn't stop people from wanting to be friendly with you. Particularly when I got to Spain or southern Italy and in the Middle East. It was more of a simulation and closer to a color that the people accepted you less questionably than they did in Europe. But on the whole, I made it my business to try to be as normal under the circumstances, to try to understand them. And one thing I found out is that most European Americans portrayed a sense of superiority, which later on I found a term that the Middle East had a term for Americans, the dirty Americans. And people wonder now why there's such animosity. It's because the Americans prior to this generation had made such asinine spectacles of themselves in those countries.
I've seen that myself.
You have?
Maybe even in the 1980s, yeah. It's been That's not my interview, but anyway, I've seen what you're talking about, and I expect it might have been a lot worse then.
It was prevalent. I was in India when India got her independence, because I was shipping with American Export Lines then, and I love going to India because you went through the Mediterranean, down through the Suez, out the Red Sea, into the Indian Ocean, then the Arabian Ocean. And when I got to India, and what is now Sri Lanka was Colombo,
Ceylon, yeah.
Ceylon, the difference in the lives, and I realized that in America we were so fortunate, because in India you had people sleeping on cots, under cots, whole families sleeping on the street, which was termed by the Indians as the untouchables. That was one of the most moving and disturbing things that I ever encountered. And I guess that's one reason why I stayed on that run, because when I came back home, I used to go to the 5 and dime Woolworth and buy clothes, cheap clothes, because then you could buy a shirt for $50, you know, a small shirt for a child for 10 or 15 cents. And we was making pretty good money. And I'd buy clothes, so when I got back to Bombay or Cochin or one of the stops in Madras or Calcutta, even this new Myanmar was
Myanmar, yeah,
Rangoon.
Burma, yeah.
That was Rangoon then.
Right.
And it was just as bad. And I would take clothes until the Americans got involved sending clothes in bales on board ship to take these clothes to people because they had none. And you'd see kids being distorted, their limbs actually being distorted by the parents so that they could beg on the street. That really moved me and opened my eyes to how fortunate myself as a black man in America was in comparison to what, and I look at that today. As a black American, yes, it could be a lot better. But I look at what the rest of the world gives the man of color, and I have a good deal. I've been relatively successful. I owe it to the Merchant Marine because I learned.
Well, one of the things that I usually ask people at the end of an interview, and we're not there yet, is sort of how they think their experience affected you. But I think you just sort of told me right there. You saw things in a way you never would have if you hadn't gone out there and done that. All right.
You can't really view it or see it unless you see it in person. When India got her independence, the Muslims and the Hindus were fighting. In Calcutta, Muslims on one side, the Hindus on the other, shooting at each other.
Is that where you were at that point?
Well, I was in Calcutta, and the captain told us of the ship that we couldn't go ashore. And I never had any problem. I get out, get a rickshaw, and go up Chowringhee, which was the main street in Calcutta, past the Victoria Hotel, and into the Indian population itself. And you'd see people shooting each other, killing each other. I remember one incident right down the street from the Victoria Hotel. The two Englishmen were in a rickshaw. A rickshaw is a vehicle on two wheels that, you know what it's like.
Yeah, that is pulled by people.
Yeah, two people. And two Indians, or a crowd of Indians, were running behind this rickshaw with a cobblestone. And they grab a hold to the wheels of this rickshaw and it tipped over. When it tipped over, the two Englishmen fell out, and this crowd of Indians took these cobblestones and began beating them. And I watched this, but there was nothing I could do because there was a mass.
Right.
And when it was all over, they just disappeared. But that was the animosity because of the English occupation
Sure.
and the freedom that the Indians, not that it, justified what had occurred, but I was struck by how vindictive and how much hate was engendered in the Indian population against the British, which had, in my estimation, completely took advantage of the whole Indian nation. And I learned so much from it.
All right. Now let's go back a little bit in terms of your career here in the Merchant Marine. You make several voyages to Europe and to the Mediterranean. Where were you when the war in Europe ended? It was like about May of '45.
I think I just come back from the Pacific. Yeah.
Okay.
And I was in Los Angeles when the war ended. And I had gone the way back to the East Coast. And everybody on the train was full of fun and joy.
Okay.
You love it. And it was just a lot of fun coming back. But I wasn't out in the street to celebrate, to say all we got was the news that it was over. But that didn't stop me from sailing. I sailed for years after that.
Okay. Now, when was the first time you went to the Pacific?
Well, that was during, let's see, they sent us from New York, that's in '45. They sent us from New York to Los Angeles, San Pedro, and I took a tanker out of San Pedro, the Bunker Hill, I remember that. It was a turbo-electric tanker, a T2 tanker. And we went to Saipan, Anahuac, and on the way back, we got a message from Honolulu that was mistakenly intercepted by the radio operator, I think, for the Bunker Hill and for the Forest Hill, and ours was the Bunker Hill. Whether he got the last end of the hill, we went into Hawaii and found out we wasn't supposed to be there. And they sent us all the way back to the States.
Do you like reminding your radio operator friends about that?
No, I wouldn't embarrass them by saying that. I'd get my head knocked off. But it was one of the unique things, and I had an opportunity which was offered by the military at that time. The government had built concrete barges, which they were towing out to the Pacific to store oil and gas for the services on the island, since they didn't have enough room. And they were offering commissions for merchant seamen to go on to live on the barges while they were out there. But I didn't want to go out there. I didn't take that.
Yeah.
It wasn't something I wanted to do.
All right. Now, when you were sailing in the Pacific before the war ended, did you go into any of the battle zone areas, or did you mostly stay away from things?
The islands I went to were after they were occupied.
Right, right.
And I never got to any of the war zones per se. I didn't even get to Korea during that conflict because I was back on the East Coast shipping out. And I was predominantly shipped out from there until in the 60s. Then I started going to Australia. And that's where I spent most of my time, the latter part of my career, going back and forth to Australia, all through the Panama Canal, until I retired.
At a certain point, did you switch out of the merchant marine and go into just private shipping, or how did that?
Well, the merchant marine remained a merchant marine. You merely got a discharge after the war.
Right.
Those that were, well, to back up a bit, in 43, to get, as I said, to get the draft off, you had to join the Naval Reserve.
There's a present for you.
Oh boy, is that for me?
That's for you.
Oh boy, thank you.
See, that's the date's 39:45.
No,
At the right time.
thank you.
There you go. All right. So you're saying about the Naval Reserve and
And that was for disciplinary and control purposes to keep the draft off you. After the war ended, I got an honorable discharge from the Naval Reserve, then just continued sailing, but as a private citizen.
right.
There was no, other than the Coast Guard for regulatory and discipline, there was no other contact with the government.
Right. Okay. And so then, how long did you continue to sail then?
I sailed until 1971.
You saw probably a lot of things in that time.
Huh?
What are there other kind of parts of that experience that you particularly remember? I mean, you talked about. I mean, there's the Indian part of it. But were you sailing, for instance, to Africa in the period when those countries were becoming independent?
Yeah. When they closed the Suez Canal, I was on the India run, and we had to go all the way around the southern tip of Africa. We stopped at Cape Town to refuel. And then all the way up the east coast of Africa into Aden, where you refueled again. And I got a glimpse to Djibouti, which is Somali. And that's when I learned about one of the astonishing things. The Sudanese, because of the heat, bathe themselves in sheep's oil. And if you want to smell something, smell rancid sheep's oil. And here these guys come aboard the ship to load and unload cargo, and it is stifling and hot. Or you run into, when the canal opened up again, you come down through the Red Sea. We encountered, or I best I can call it, a storm of locusts coming from the Arabian side of the Red Sea, going to the African side. And you're standing out there, here's all of these grasshoppers, we call grasshoppers.
Yeah.
And the sky is almost blank. With the grasshoppers, you see them falling down in the stack from the heat coming out with the smoke. It's flying. When they're falling in the stack, they're falling on the deck, they're hopping all over the deck. You gotta run back in the house, shut your, and it's hot. You've got to bolt down your portholes or close the glasses to keep the crickets, grasshoppers or locusts from coming in. You close the doors, and can you imagine what that's like in that kind of weather? It is stupefying, and you're working in the engine room. No such thing as air conditioning then. It was hot.
Okay. What was the best kind of ship to crew on?
Well, after the war, they had the C1s, C2s, and C3s. Their accommodations were a lot better. And each watch, firemen, water tenders, the fireman, water tender, the order. Normally there's a combination, fireman, water tender was the same. And the order had their own rooms and shared a bathroom with the order, or either the deck engineer or one of the other watchers. So that you had some privacy, but on board the Liberty ships, It was bare steel walls.
Mm-hmm.
In some places they blew the asbestos as insulation on the walls of the ship.
Yeah.
And now I know what asbestos did for you.
Mm-hmm.
And but that time it was for warmth.
Mm-hmm.
One time when I went to England, they wanted to find guys that were ready to change from the convoys coming into England to transfer to ships that were going to Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And you could change ships and take that, continue your voyage if you wanted to. But it was too cold going up there.
Mm-hmm.
So I never did want one of those. But the accommodations were better on the latest ships. Then there was the Victory ships. They were a bit more comfortable and they were faster ships. The Liberty ships were the old 8, 10 knots.
Mm-hmm.
The Liberty ships were the workhorses.
Mm-hmm.
And actually they saved the United States during the war. They built them, they sunk them, and they built some more.
Yep.
But after that, it just got to be fast and speed.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, the United States gave up its superiority in shipbuilding, as it has,
Yes.
with everything else, to foreign nations. We have no merchant marine now.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't tell you one shipping company that is American owned. I don't know of any. If there are any, maybe one or two.
But even if they are, they probably have ships with foreign registry.
Oh yeah, they assign the cargo. Even our military is assigning foreign ships to carry our military cargo.
Mm-hmm.
What happens if we have another war? We got no merchant marine. We're paying everybody else to do what Americans should be doing for their country. Look at what they did with the new tanker. Boeing, Glenn Martin, all of them build tankers. But we got to give it to a foreign country, and we're paying for it.
Now, what led you to decide to leave shipping? As you retire out of there in '71?
That's, if I may say so a bit. Well, you know, I have been married 3 times, and all of them failed because I was in the merchant marine. They say absence make the heart grow fonder, but they never tell you for who. So as a seaman, it grows fonder for somebody else, and you find out too late. And my third wife, I thought if I stopped sailing, I could save it, but it didn't help. And once I had retired, I just got into a comfortable job with Shore and stayed there.
What kind of work did you get into?
Well, I got into industrial maintenance, and I worked for the military at Fort Dix and various Army installations where government contracts were involved in private industry. Took over a government contract where maintenance was involved, and I worked it that way. And then finally I went to work for various industrial entities in the same maintenance department as maintenance man, maintenance supervisor, and that's where I retired from when I retired working.
All right. Are there other particular events from your time traveling around the world that sort of stick out in your mind or are particularly distinctive? Things that you tend to remember a lot?
Well, mostly my time to really get back into the American life was a kind of shock. The extreme difference to what I was used to on board ship. On board ship, you did your job.
Right.
You got respect. You were just another seaman. Occasionally, the racial issues came up, but very, very rarely. But when I started working ashore, is when the monstrosity of racial bigotry really came home to roost. It was painful because all of my growing up, I hadn't really experienced it. I would get periodic and infrequent brushes with it because I stayed at sea.
Right.
But when I came back home, I was confronted with it in travel. Well, my family originally was from South Carolina. If I went to visit them, the social mores, the racial mores there was in evidence. And occasionally, often I'd run into it in New Jersey. And it was something you had to, although it was painful, you had to deal with it. You learned to wear more or less a coat of armor. You know it's there, but you physiologically and emotionally set your barriers up so that the pain, the shock, the unfairness of it didn't make you bitter and lose your perspective.
You stay better than they are.
If I could live through it, and I did, I was a better person.
Right.
I always carried with me, ignorance is bliss. So if you don't know me, you're not going to know me. And I don't have to prove who I am. It caused me to lose a lot of my philosophical bent to develop a philosophy that fit me as an individual. And I turned to agnosticism rather than the accepted religions because I saw too much hypocrisy in it. Where they say, love your fellow man and all of that. That was only words. No one was living it. So I had to develop the philosophy that got me through life. It made me a better person, which I hope it did.
You've certainly become an impressive one.
Yeah.
So I want to thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me.
It's been a pleasure and I've enjoyed it.
All right.
And I hope that